There are many famous stories that have circulated when it comes to the ruler of Egypt, Cleopatra. But how many of them are actually true? And what do we really know of her life and her reign? Welcome back into the hive, my fellow buzzing bees. It's me, Amanda, and today we are counting down the top 10 bizarre facts about Cleopatra you never knew. What is your favorite factoid about ancient Egypt? Are there any other figures or things from this period in time that you would like to learn more about? Let us know. Number 10. Her time as ruler. While many think of Queen Cleopatra as a woman who sort of connived her way to a place of power by seducing men, this isn't exactly the truth. Now, while she definitely did some seducing of sorts as part of political strategies, she was actually ruling even before she was ever queen. Initially, Cleopatra VII started out as a ruler, being appointed as co-regent by her father when he fell ill, the year before his death. While she wasn't queen at the time, she was a co-regent that he actually chose to aid him in his rule. So while not considered a regent solely by herself, she was still helping him to rule. Cleopatra has often been noted as being a loyal and loving daughter to her father, King Ptolemy. While her reign technically started after his death with her becoming queen alongside her brother, she really was involved in ruling actually a little bit earlier than that, which I think also just goes to show that she was probably being, groomed to be a ruler since she was probably even younger. And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at Bumblebee, be sure to let us know by giving this video a thumbs up. Do bees have thumbs? I don't think so, but put on get your little legs and put on your thumb glove and just hit the keyboard, bees. My little bees. Number 9. Cleopatra and the Carpet. One of the most famous stories involving Cleopatra is the one where she meets Caesar. It was said that in order to ensure she was able to meet him and not prevented from doing so by her brother's forces, that she herself snuck into Julius Caesar's private quarters in the palace by being smuggled in, rolled up in a carpet. Upon unrolling the carpet to show Caesar, there lie Cleopatra, who in some versions of the story is also completely naked? Is this true? Well, maybe. Some accounts of the tale have her more realistically smuggled in via a bed sack, which would be a linen sack that would obviously be, I think, easier to get into and out of and a lot less terrifying and claustrophobic than being rolled up inside a carpet when it comes to traveling into the palace. And as for her being naked, it's actually more likely based on accounts that Cleopatra would have been dressed up to the nines in order to impress Caesar by showing off her status and her power, dressed as the queen that she was. Probably would have been dressed up in that way too, to kind of be like, look at me, I look so powerful, but at the same time I need your help, which then makes Caesar feel really powerful, you know what I mean? Number 8. Not Egyptian. Despite some of the depictions of Cleopatra, she was not actually Egyptian in terms of her family's heritage or in terms of her actual appearance. Most of her family that came before, at least in regards to the men, and likely based on what we know, also in regards to the women, though women in history are famously much harder to trace because historians usually paid less attention to them in their records, was Macedonian. Her lineage can be traced all the way back to Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander the Great's generals. Many of the Egyptian depictions you see of Cleopatra usually have some religious significance, which is why she was usually styled in that way, because it relates back to Egyptian religion and their beliefs. Based on her appearance on coins, which she herself would have actually approved of, it's believed that in her everyday life, Cleopatra generally presented herself in the Greek style. So she's really more Greek than she is Egyptian, although she is of Egypt, and she definitely did love some Egyptian things and customs. Number 7. Cleopatra and Aphrodite. When it came time for Cleopatra to win the heart and mind of Marc Antony, who she allied with following Caesar's death, Cleopatra did not need to resort to being smuggled in via linen sacks. Being cemented as Egypt's ruler by that time, Cleopatra instead used her power and wealth as ruler of Egypt to win Antony over. Supposedly, Cleopatra styled herself as the Greek goddess Aphrodite, rowing out to meet Antony on a golden barge with silver oars and big purple sails, with her attendants dressed as cupids. This obviously was a smart move, considering Antony often spoke on how he was the living embodiment of the Greek god Dionysus, the god of wine, pleasure, and festivity. Also, Dionysus and Aphrodite, I believe, had a thing in Greek mythology for a little bit, so yeah, you see what they're doing. Number 6. Married to her brother. While Cleopatra is more famous for her love affairs with famous Roman leaders like Julius Caesar and Marc Antony, prior to any of those relationships, and even kind of during the start of her relationship with Caesar, Cleopatra was actually married to her own brother, Ptolemy VIII. However, this marriage was Of course, not a happy one, as both siblings vied for power, each basically wanting to rule in their own right, independent from the other. Also, they were siblings, also he was 10 and she was 18 when they got married. Also, while it might seem weird to marry your brother, I know you might be thinking that and you're thinking, why are you not acknowledging that? Well, in the Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt, this was actually really normal and was done to protect their lineage's power. So by today's standards, yeah, it's weird, but back then, this was like everyday stuff. Number 5. Drank pearls? The story goes that Cleopatra once had a wager with Marc Antony, who became her lover after Julius Caesar was killed during the Ides of March. Day after day, Cleopatra had entertained Antony with lavish banquets. The version of the story I know best is that each day the banquets Cleopatra threw in his honor were basically more and more lavish, ramping up. One day, Antony asked her if it was possible for them to be even more decadent. How could it be possible? Cleopatra promised him it was, accepting the challenge and offering that the next banquet would be worth tens of millions of sesterces. When the day came, the banquet seemed quite opulent, but not more so than the day before, and Antony inquired as to how Cleopatra planned on winning the wager between them. She answered that she herself would consume a single meal worth as much as was promised. She had a cup of vinegar brought to her and a pearl. Supposedly, she dissolved the pearl in the vinegar and then drank it. She was actually going to do it with a second pearl, but was apparently stopped. Now, while many historians have actually dismissed this story, as it was also one recounted by Pliny the Elder, a Roman historian who was most definitely not a fan of Cleopatra, according to science, this is actually possible. However, the pearl that Cleopatra dissolved is also said to be one of 2 of the biggest in the world at the time, both of which Cleopatra owned, and it apparently takes a day or longer to dissolve a pearl in vinegar, and that is considered to be a small pearl. Still, we weren't at the banquet that day, and even with rumors used to discredit or disparage someone in history, there's usually some grain of truth to them, no matter how small. If some version of the story did actually happen, it's more likely that Cleopatra pretended to dissolve the pearl in vinegar and drank it to impress Antony and be declared the winner of the bet, being a smart person who is no stranger to performing in this way, while perhaps at the same time somehow concealing that the pearl actually survived the ordeal and was not actually dissolved, because that would be quite wasteful, and I think even Cleopatra would know that. A little bit of trickery for the purpose of entertaining and amusing her guests. Number 4. The tragedy of Marc Antony and Cleopatra. Something that I think is fascinating about Cleopatra is that while she was a great figure, to this day we don't truly know how she actually died. There are stories that were circulated of her and Antony taking their own lives together after their defeat, but based on what we do know, it was actually Antony who died first after being misled to believe that Cleopatra had taken her own life already. He was forced to take his own life after his own attendant apparently refused to kill himself. He was forced to take his own life after his own attendant refused to kill him, instead using their sword to take their own life, so that Antony was basically forced to do the same. However, he was apparently brought to Cleopatra while he was still clinging to life, because the blow that he gave himself was not, it was fatal, but it wasn't like immediately dead. So he got to her and then later died of his self-inflicted injuries while he was in her presence, which is not as romantic as them dying together, but still pretty romantic when you think about it. But I also wonder, like, how did he even, that seems like a lot to get to someone while you're literally dying. Number 3. Her father paid to have Egypt invaded. Well, the people of Egypt thought it best if Bernice IV, the king's daughter, and Cleopatra VI, who was not our Cleopatra but likely Ptolemy's former wife or perhaps another of his daughters, ruled them. Ptolemy VII had some other plans. To cement his rule, he allied with Rome, who he saw as a major world power, and honestly, rightfully so. If you can believe it though, Ptolemy actually bribed Rome to cement their allyship. Later, after he was exiled by his people for bribing Rome to ally with them, Ptolemy then paid Rome 10,000 talents or more, which by today's standards would be either over $1 million or possibly even worth $10 billion or more if we're talking gold talents as opposed to silver, to basically invade Egypt and recover his throne for him after he had been exiled. Much of the funds he had given to Rome previously when he had bribed them had been borrowed from Roman lenders, which encouraged them to accept the second bribe to reclaim Ptolemy's throne so their own lenders could actually be repaid by him, because if he didn't have the throne, how was he supposed to repay them? Get it? While it's kind of crazy, it's also kind of smart on Ptolemy's part, to be honest. Number 2. She was not the last to rule. While many think of the death of Cleopatra as the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, her son, said to also be the son of Julius Caesar, Caesarion, was actually considered the last of her line to rule Egypt. While his father was not a Ptolemy, his mother still was. After she was removed from power, he was left as sole ruler until his mother took her own life. And if you're wondering, yeah, Caesarion did rule, but really Cleopatra ruled. ruled. So he was the ruler, but she was helping him rule, and really she was running the show. Granted, while he did get to rule alone briefly, Caesarion would have had no power as Egypt had still lost to Rome and was being held by Roman soldiers. So this would have probably been pretty terrifying for him. He was ruler, but also at the same time he was very much a prisoner. After Cleopatra took her own life, her son was captured and killed, as his claim to the throne would have been considered a threat to Rome's control over Egypt. Number 1. The Asp Bite. There are accounts that suggest Cleopatra had designs on taking her life, but she was captured and interrupted from doing so, being removed from her own tomb to when she had retreated to take out the act. Only later, after learning that Augustus Octavius planned on parading her through the streets of Rome, did she once again turn to plotting her own death. I think before that she was kind of hoping there might be some way she could spin this to keep control. What we don't know for certain is the cause of her death though, which is very mysterious. It likely was poison, not an asp, that took Cleopatra's life, although the snakebite story is the one more often told and romanticized through art. More likely, her death was caused by a poisonous ointment or a hollow hairpin which was used to puncture her skin and introduce poison into her bloodstream. That's about it for this one. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you in the future. The 12th? The 12th? Pretty sure it's the 7th. The 12th? No, that can't be right. Oh boy. Oh boy. Alright, I'm just gonna say King Ptolemy, because he was a Ptolemy. I know that. And we'll